The second Haarlem artist we're going to talk about is Geertgen tot Sint Jans. Now, his last name is not tot Sint Jans. His name is Geertgen, which means little Gerard. I guess in English we'd say Jerry. It's the diminutive for Gerard. So little Gerard, or little Gerard, at St. John's. Now, what is the St. John's? He was a painter who lived with the Knights of St. John at Haarlem. They're known sometimes as the Jansheren. Now, von Mander tells us that he was not a member of the order, and in his records, it would translate something like servant painter. So he was you might have a court painter. In this case, he's a painter to the Knights of St. John in Haarlem. Okay, who are the Knights of St. John? Well, they're a military order, but it's a military religious order. It's also known as the Order of the Hospitallers, or the Order of St. John. And it began as a religious order to provide care for pilgrims going to the Holy Land and to defend them. And it became a military order in defense of the Holy Land. You've probably heard of the Knights Templar. That was a different order. And by this time, the Knights Templar had been horribly suppressed and persecuted and were no more. But the Knights of St. John still survived, and they had different houses. This was the commandery, or the house, that was in Haarlem. Their headquarters originally were in Jerusalem, but after the Christians lost the Holy Land, they lost Jerusalem to the Islamic forces, they moved their headquarters to Rhodes. And at this time, the headquarters were in Rhodes. Later on, in the 16th century, they also lose Rhodes, and they moved to Malta. And you may have heard of the Knights of Malta. It's the same order, but at a later time. Now, what about Geertgen? Von Mander tells us some things about Geertgen. He says that Geertgen was a pupil of Auwater, and that Geertgen died young, around 28 years old. We don't know whether that's absolutely true. Remember, von Mander is writing much later. But we have, a major Haarlem artist who's still remembered, still known something about by, let's say, the early 17th century. And we have another artist whom we have what von Mander says, and we do have some documents. There's also some intriguing documents. There is a Geertgen, which once again, that just means Jerry, little Gerard, young Gerard, de Hollander. In other words, little Gerard from Holland, or from the North Netherlands, is recorded as being in the Bruges Illuminators Guild in 1475. Now, is that Geertgen tot Sint Jans? There are some people who think maybe he started as an illuminator. The truth is we don't know, because Gerard and little Gerard would be common names. All apprentices are entered in documents with the diminutive of their name. So, for example, if somebody is named John, we would say, instead of being written down as Jan or Johannes, he'd be Anneken, which is Johnny, little John. So this is, Jerry from Holland. It could be Geertgen, or it could be somebody else. We do know, and we'll see some examples of that he did know work that was in Flanders, that he did know something about the Netherlandish artists in the South Netherlands. So it's possible that he did travel there. We don't know if he was trained there or not. Now, von Mander mentions a work by Geertgen tot Sint, and he says that with the Knights of St. John, in their chapel, there was a triptych of the Lamentation, but that the center and one wing had been destroyed, either by iconoclasm or by war. But what survived was one of the wings. And there's a painting on both sides, and it has been sawn apart so we can look at them as though they were two separate paintings. So this is the inside, the inner wing, probably the inner wing of the triptych of the crucifixion. And as you can see, it's a lamentation over the body of Christ. It was made for the Knights of St. John. It stood on their altar, but the other parts have been destroyed. And you can see here that he did know some artists from Flanders, because you have the figure here of presumably Joseph of Arimathea kneeling, putting his hand against his heart. And this is the same pose, and the beard is also similar, to the middle Magus in Hugo van der Hoos's Adoration of the Magi. And that figure seems to be quoted, as it were, in a number of figures in paintings by Geertgen tot Sint. You can also see his Mary Magdalene, who's down in the lower left of the painting. She's kneeling. She's wearing a red dress and has this green mantle that is flowing around her. And she's holding her hands in this somewhat awkward gesture where it's very angular. And she's wringing her hands, and her elbows are in very angular pose. You'll remember seeing a very similar hand wringing in Rogier van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross. And also, we've seen these holy women wiping their eyes with the edge of their headdress, their veils. And remember that Rogier van der Weyden also did that. So he seems to be familiar with Flemish painting. And here we're going to look at some details. We have the people who are mourning Christ, John, the evangelist, who is shown here as, the young beloved apostle with his curling locks and youthful face. Nicodemus, who is standing, taking his hood off in mourning, and we've seen the kneeling, devout Joseph of Arimathea with his hand across his breast, and the weeping woman. And then you see another figure in the background. And, he's holding, it looks like maybe he's holding a winding cloth. He's holding a cloth, and he's dressed as a contemporary person in Haarlem. Okay. He may be one of the donors. There's one of the people who was an officer at the Knights of St. John. And so he is portrayed there as, I've talked to you about participatory devotion, the idea where you can imagine that you are there and interacting with the holy people. You are present by thought, as Ludwig of Saxony says. And people were often painted into the paintings. Sometimes the donors are right there. You'll remember Pierre Bladelin in the Bladelin Nativity by Rogier van der Weyden. Now he's kneeling right next to the Christ child. So here is another, presumably donor, who becomes a participant. He becomes one of the mourners surrounding the body of Christ. There is a prayer by Ludwig of Saxony that says, "Lord, make of me a Joseph of Arimathea." So, here he is, like Joseph, one of the mourners. And here we see the women, Mary Magdalene in red, Mary the mother, kneeling, gazing at her son. And you might notice how the veil comes down and forms this curving form that leads us to the face of Christ, as well as Mary's gaze leads us to the face of Christ. And then there is the other holy woman in the background who just stares out of us at us, desolate with sorrow. Christ is displayed for the viewer's adoration. He is shown on the winding cloth of the shroud before he has been buried, and also displayed in the foreground are instruments of the Passion, the crown of thorns, and 3 nails that pierced Christ's hand and feet. You'll remember we said that the Haarlem painters were interested in landscape, and they were known for their beautiful landscapes. And alas, except for Geertgen, paintings of this period, there isn't much survival. So if Karl von Mander is correct, if he is correct, and Geertgen was trained by Alvater, we might be seeing here the legacy of Alvater, or at least this reputation that von Mander passes on to us of the Haarlem painters who are very interested in landscapes. And so you have this beautiful vista, going back, further and further into the distance, the hazy mountains in the distance. We also have some scenes in the background. We have the burial of the thieves. They're being taken down from the cross and sort of just plunked in a hole at Golgotha. And here we can go in, and you can see how detailed it is. We always talk about the Netherlandish artists having, naturalistic details, and certainly you can see this. Chainmail, little swirls of paint on the beard of one of the people burying the thieves. And even those little tiny figures silhouetted against the sky, presumably Pilate and Caiaphas, perhaps. You can see them in pretty remarkable detail for their scale. So you see the overall image. And you can also see, of course, where Christ is going to be laid. The rock-cut tomb behind the mourners on the right. And you'll remember Joseph of Arimathea gave his tomb so that Christ could be buried there. Now, the other side, this would have been the outside of the panel of the Lamentation. So, when the triptych was closed, you would have had 2 scenes, and the other one doesn't survive, but there they are. You can see the outside. And the outside is a very unique image. It tells us the legend of the bones of St. John the Baptist. And, it goes under a number of titles. One is the burning of the bones of the Baptist, which is alliterative. And so this is the exterior wing for the lost crucifixion triptych that was made by Geertgen for the Knights of St. John. And it would have been the reverse of the Lamentation. And you can see that there are many scenes going on. You have this historiated landscape with the burning of the bones of the Baptist in the foreground, and then you have the middle ground where you have, we're going to talk about who these people might be, holding bones, carrying them off. A little further back, we see the body buried, we see what happens to the skull, and then a beautiful landscape in the background. Okay. The legend of the body and the bones of St. John the Baptist can be found in Jacobus de Voragines' Golden Legend. Now, I may have told you before about the Golden Legend. It is a 13th century book that tells the story of the lives of the saints. It was originally written to serve priests who had, to make sermons on the days of saints, and they didn't know all the saints, so they could read what had happened from Voragines' Golden Legend. And I should also mention that legend comes from the word for reading. So we have the idea of a legend of something that's not true. It's just a story. The Golden Legend, to us, may be just stories, but they were the golden readings. They were believed to be true. So, why so interested in the bones of the Baptist? Well, what you have is relics that were acquired by the Knights of St. John. They were acquired by the Knights of St. John in Rhodes, I might say. Here they're placing them with the commandery of Haarlem. And there also was a visit from the head of the order to the Haarlem Knights of St. John. So we'll hear more about that. What we're seeing is scenes from different times in history. In the background, in the upper left, or the far middle ground, perhaps we could call it, we have the burial of the body of John the Baptist. Now you remember that under the order of King Herod, John was decapitated. And so we're seeing the body being buried, but the head, as we'll see, was buried separately. So these are followers of John who are putting him in a sarcophagus, his body into a sarcophagus. A little further in the background, we can see something about the legend and the finding of the head of the Baptist. And the story was that Herodias, the wife of King Herod, I guess she was afraid that John the Baptist would rise from the dead or something. So she thought she would bury the head separately. And she's supposed to have buried it in a dung heap. She wanted it never to be found, to just be trash. Now, we're not seeing that exactly there. And that's what I thought originally this scene would be. But the legend is a little more complicated than that. The wife of Herod's steward, who was given the name Joanna, and so she's known as Saint Joanna, she finds the head, and she reburies the head of St. John the Baptist on the Mount of Olives. So that perhaps is what's really going on here. Because obviously it's not in a dung heap. So the reburial of the head. And this is a small detail in the upper right. Now, what are we seeing in the front? Well, we're seeing these figures, and you can see some of them have, fairly ugly, somewhat slightly distorted faces, which was one way that artists sometimes tried to show that someone was evil. We'll see this becoming even more exaggerated as we get into the 16th century with, the late 15th and the early 16th century with Hieronymus Bosch, and then with Peter Bruegel, where in that case the tormentors of Christ are often shown with horrible features. But you can find it much earlier. Here, the bad guys, as it were, is Julian the Apostate. Julian was a Roman emperor. You may know that when Constantine became the Roman emperor in 312, the next year, in 313, he passed a law, the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity a legal religion in the Roman Empire. Constantine's mother was a Christian. known as St. Helena. And the story is that Constantine was eventually baptized on his deathbed, although he endowed, had built many Christian churches before then. So he's called the first Christian emperor. And from there on out, almost all the emperors of Rome, the Roman emperors, were Christians. In the late 4th century, I think 394, 395, Theodosius made a law that Christianity was the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. Well, I said almost all the emperors were Christians. For a very short period of time, as you can see, 361 to 363, one Roman emperor, Julian, tried to restore the traditional Roman religion, what the Christians would have called the pagan religion, with, for example, Jupiter, best and greatest, would be the king of the gods. He tried to restore the traditional Roman religion. But as you can see, he didn't live that long, and it didn't stick. And as you know, as I just told you, Theodosius, at the end of the 4th century, declared that Christianity was the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. So Julian the Apostate is often the bad guy in Christian stories, just as Diocletian, who persecuted Christians, is shown often as the evil emperor in stories of the martyrdoms of saints. So as you can see, he's got this very strange, elaborate-looking crown, which actually is a kind of fantastical variant on the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor, which does have some of those pieces coming up at the top, but it doesn't look exactly like that by any means. But he's shown here at the guy with the long beard and the long scepter and the exotic-looking crown. And, he's not the handsomest guy. So he's sort of, the evil emperor here. And he has counselors around him, as you can see. And he's trying to wipe out Christianity, so he orders the body of the Baptist disinterred and burned. So, the followers buried it. Now he wants all those bones burnt so that, no one, can worship his tomb, and, no one will have, relics of him, perhaps. So we see what was supposed to have taken place in the 4th century, the burning of the bones of the Baptists. And you see, bones are being heaped into the fire, and the person in the foreground, who is in this, sort of wearing these orange tights, he's lifting up a kind of shovel and scattering the ashes to the wind. So the wind shall pick up these ashes, and there will be no physical remains of John the Baptist. However, some relics, they believe, survived. You may or may not know that there are a number of skulls that even during the Middle Ages, people started to wonder about them, because they'd go to different churches and they'd all say, well, we've got the skull of John the Baptist. And some other church would say, we've got the skull of John the Baptist. And so, well, how can this be? Oh, we've got the skull of him when he was 13 years old. Okay. Well, one of the things that was often said of relics is they could multiply. They are miraculous. A relic is the physical remains of a holy person, or sometimes it's something that has come into contact with that holy person. They say the tunic of the Virgin at Chartres. And so there were a number of bones that were believed to be the surviving bones of John the Baptist. That some bones were rescued and were not burnt. And the members of they're showing the members of the Knights of St. John at Haarlem handling these relics and taking them out of the sarcophagus, as though they are going to rescue them. The Knights at Rhodes had acquired relics that had been given to them. And one was the finger of St. John the Baptist, the finger with which he points to Christ and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And the other was a thigh bone. And you can see them holding a thigh bone and something else that's smaller here. Presumably there's a finger bone in there. Here we can see there's a finger, there's a thigh. You might also notice that 5 of these figures have what we call today a Maltese cross. It's a Greek cross, a cross where the arms are all equal length, and then they're split at the ends. And these are the cross. The reason they call them the Maltese cross is because they were worn by the Knights of Malta, who, of course, are the Jans Training. They're the Knights of St. John. Later on, they went to Malta. But they were wearing that cross first before we ever gave it the name Maltese cross. So this is the cross that was worn by members of the Order of St. John. And you can see there's 5 people here who are wearing that cross. And this corresponds to, in documents, 5 of the officers who are mentioned in the documents and greeting the Grand Prior of the Order of St. John. And in 1483, he visited Haarlem. And it had only been shortly before that they had acquired these relics. So what's happening there, I guess you could say they're shuffling history a little. They're showing the members of the commandery of St. John, the Order of St. John, or the Jans Training, the Knights of St. John, as though they are receiving and they are finding these relics. But it certainly commemorates the visit of the Grand Prior. So that gives us a kind of terminus. We know that it can't be painted before 1484. Now, I should also talk to you about this as a group portrait. But you have members of the same order or the same organization, and they're undoubtedly very realistic portraits, likenesses. They want to be known. They want to show that they have these offices. They're showing for their devotion to John the Baptist. Group portraits become very important type of art in the Netherlands in the 17th century. We have many group portraits by Rembrandt and by Frans Hals. And so this is the ancestor of those. Geertgen from Haarlem is showing us a group portrait within the context of a sacred story. Now, one of the figures is looking away. He isn't wearing the Cross of Malta, and it's been suggested that this figure is a self-portrait of Geertgen tot Sint Jans. It kind of makes sense that he might put himself in this painting because it seems to be full of portraits of people in the order, and he is a servant to the order, and he's the painter. So he can put himself in. He's not trying to show himself in a main place. He's not receiving the bones. He's sort of off to the side and looking off to the side. A little bit more humility there, perhaps. And we can look at the details. Here are the officers. We see them twice in the picture. We see them behind the sarcophagus, taking the bones, and then we see them walking back to their house, the building that houses the order. So here the officers of the Knights of St. John are holding the relics that's been given to the Order of Rhodes in 1482-3. And so the altarpiece is commemorating both the acquisition of those relics and the visit of the Grand Prior to Haarlem. And then, of course, as we mentioned, beautiful landscape backgrounds. They're in the burning of the bones of the Baptist also. Here's a little detail. Well, we've seen Geertgen can paint, great vistas, but he can also paint very small Aandagsbeelden, or devotional pictures. This is in Utrecht. It is a man of sorrows, and we've talked about that subject before with Master Franke. So I want to remind you a little bit of that. What is the man of sorrows? The man of sorrows shows Christ suffering as though he has died, and his wounds are on him. Sometimes he's shown as though he's still dead and held up by angels or holy people. Sometimes he's shown as though he's alive and displays his wounds. And often in association with the instruments of the Passion. The term in German is Schmerzenmann, and there are a lot of these in Germany. The phrase man of sorrows actually comes from Isaiah 53, which was interpreted as a prophecy of the Passion of Christ. And it talks about the sufferings of this figure who is interpreted as Christ. He says he's the despised and most abject of men, a man of sorrows, and we esteemed him not. So, a man of sorrows is the suffering Christ shown with the instruments of the Passion. Now, we do have this phrase, Aandagsbeeld. It's a German word, and it could be translated as a devotional image, or very literally, as an image to meditate on. Bild is image in German. It's sometimes used for sculpture, but it could also be used for painting. And dacht is to think, dachen. To think on is aandachen. So it's an image to think on. It's an image to meditate on. It's not a narrative. It's not showing you what it looked like at the crucifixion or at the lamentation. It's a kind of timeless scene about the suffering of Christ. And as you can see, we have details here of angels holding the instruments of the Passion as they lament. One is holding the 3 nails. Another one is holding the spear with the sponge, where Christ says, "I thirst," and they give him vinegar that's been, they raise up a sponge that's been soaked in vinegar. And then there is the spear. There was the lance with which Christ's side was pierced. It's cut off a little in the detail, but I think you can see some of the blood on the tip. And then you have the very edge, the column of the flagellation with these whips and flails that are attached to it. So it's referring to the things with which Christ was tortured. And we look at, Christ looks out at us. He looks at the viewer. He looks at the devotee and establishes eye contact. And how are you supposed to react? Well, if you were a devout viewer, you would be reacting with, "Oh my goodness, he suffered so much for me." He's suffering to save mankind from their sins. He's suffering because of the sins of all humanity. And of course, during the Mass, and you could say it during prayers too, the congregation repeats the words, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. My guilt, my maximum guilt, my huge guilt. I am guilty of causing this, not just the Romans, or they used to say the Jews did it, which never made sense to me because, of course, Jews did not crucify anybody. It's Romans that crucify people, and the Jews were a subject nation under, a very cruel ruler, Pontius Pilate, who's recorded as being very harsh and killing people for what we would say are no reason at all. but it is for the sins of all mankind that Christians believe that Christ died. And of course, you see him in this image and many other devotional images with the blood just coursing down, as though he has just been whipped, hundreds and hundreds of times, and his skin is lacerated, and the blood, as you can see, it's coursing from the wound in his hand, from the wound in his side, and then all over his body. And of course, Christians of this period believed that, in fact, Catholics still do, believe that the Mass, the Holy Sacrament of the bread and wine, reenacts Christ's sacrifice in a bloodless manner and makes merits for the souls of mankind. So there's also the association not only with the historical crucifixion, but also with the Mass. Now, let's look a little at the composition, because besides the things that are in the picture, the way that they're shown also adds to the feeling and the meaning of this. You can see, I should name some people first, though, just so you know who everybody is. Down in the lower left, this is Mary Magdalene, her hands together, looking into the tomb, eyes downcast. The mother, Mary, looking at Christ with her hands clasped. John, rubbing his eyes and supporting Mary with the other hand. Just a little bit of St. John. You just see him, he's sort of chopped off by the edge. And you'll notice that the composition has a lot of diagonal movement in it and a lot of angular forms. The sarcophagus goes not just parallel to the picture plane, it sort of goes off at an angle. The cross is held as though it's tipping back, and it's another angular form. And you can see some of the angular forms in the draperies and the poses and the ways that things are arranged. It's not calm at any means. Everything is set up as a kind of tension, to reinforce this feeling of suffering and agony. And there you see detail of Mary Magdalene. You'll notice that her head, and you've probably noticed this already with Geertgen tot Sint female figures particularly, the heads are these ovoids. They're egg-shaped heads almost. And you can see the tears coursing down her face. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that they did find the marks of the hinges on the panel. So it's been suggested that this is not just a diptych or a single panel. The hinges looked to some people like door hinges, that they thought maybe this could have been a door to the tabernacle that once held the host of the sacrament, which would be, of course, you could use this painting either as, purely a devotional image, or, it would work in relationship to holding the consecrated host of the sacrament. This is a night nativity that's been attributed to Geertgen tot Sint. And it's believed to possibly derive from or copy a lost painting by Hugo van der Hoes. But certainly it has Geertgen's own style with the figures. And you can see it's a very close-up image. It's very dark. And, there are some examples of dark scenes with holy light in them. You can think as early as the Limborg brothers and the crucifixion in the Trevi-Jésus as a night scene, a very dark scene. In this case, it's related to the vision of St. Bridget of Sweden told in her Revelations, in which, of course, she was at Bethlehem. She had a vision of Mary telling her and showing her, so she had a vision of the birth of Christ. And in it, she says that the child was lying on the ground, naked and shining. And the radiance of the child, was Joseph was holding a candle, and the light from the candle was nothing compared, to the spiritual light that's coming from the Christ child. So you can see here that the main source of light, it's a night scene, the main source of light is the Christ child, laid in the manger, adored by Mary and the angels and the ox and the ass, whom we see in the deep shadow. And what's illuminating them is the light from Christ, is spiritual light. There he is, radiant. Now, we do have a word for this. We call it tenebroso, or sometimes, which means shadowy in Italian. And it's sometimes changed to tenebrism to make it a kind of English noun out of the Italian word. I always think of tenebroso, which means shadowy, as a light shining in a dark world. And as you can see, that has not only the meaning of making this physically dramatic, but also, it has the spiritual meaning, the light of Christ shining in a world made dark by sin. Now, there is a secondary light, which is also a spiritual light. And that is the light that shines from the angel who is announcing the birth of Christ to the shepherds. So you see this radiant angel in the sky, and you'll notice that the shepherds have a little fire. But, it's the natural light of the fire is very little compared to the light of the angel. And of course, the light of Christ outshines them all. You'll remember that in St. Bridget's vision, she said that the light from Joseph's candle was as nothing. I'm not sure whether Joseph was holding a candle here. I don't really see it. But we can see that idea that the shepherd's fire is as nothing. It's very small compared to spiritual light. Here we're looking at that geometric ovoid of the head. There's a number of artists in the Netherlands who do that. You'll remember, not quite the shape, a little perhaps heftier perhaps. Petrus Christus often uses some rounded ovoid heads. There's another artist who is the master of the Virgin among virgins. So, it's not unique to Geertgen, and in fact, I will say that some attributions are believed to be, by some people, followers of Geertgen. I'm not going to try to sort that out. This painting also has been attributed to Geertgen tot Sint Jans. When you look at the details, you'll see why. It's been known by several names: the Madonna of the Rosary, the Madonna in the Sun, which is related to the idea of the woman clothed in the sun from Revelations 12. And in Revelations, there is, of course, it's the vision of St. John, the evangelist, that he had when he was exiled to the island of Patmos. He's seen essentially, in parts of it, at the end of the world. But he has a vision, and part of it is there is a woman clothed in the sun with the crescent moon at her feet and stars in her crown. And she gives birth to a child, to a son. And she is threatened by the seven-headed dragon whose tail sweeps the stars from the sky. And there is an angel who comes and rescues the child and bears the child up to heaven. And the dragon pours out water to drown the woman. But the woman is given the wings of an eagle, and she flies off and escapes the dragon. Well, it's a vision. It's very visual. As you say these things, you can see them, and they have been the subject, of course, of art for millennia. Right up to the present day, actually. But that is the story of the woman clothed in the sun, and she was very, very early on believed to be a symbolic representation of Mary and the child of Christ. Now, when we look at this picture, you'll notice that it's made up of this small figure of Mary, sort of a half-length or maybe three-quarter length picture of Mary holding the baby Jesus. And you have concentric circles. They are bright, the light of the sun, as it were, the spiritual light emanating from the Madonna and Child. And they're all in a kind of oval shape around Mary and Christ. The lightest section of these ovals is in the areas that's closest to Mary, and then as we get further and further out, they become darker and darker, but you can still see these sort of translucent, transparent angels where only the highlights are painted. So I have a little detail here so you can see, and what are these angels holding? Well, as we'll see, I'll show you a detail in a moment. Some of them are holding rosaries, hence it's called the Madonna of the Rosary by some people. And many of them hold musical instruments. Some hold instruments of the Passion. You can see here an angel holding the column of the flagellation. You can see other angels with different musical instruments that they're playing. And we'll also see a detail of the angels at the top who have little signs that they're holding up that say Sanctus, or holy. And here you can see one of the angels holding up a rosary. Now, in 1478, the Confraternity of the Rosary was founded in Haarlem. And this was the first Confraternity of the Rosary in the Netherlands. There had been rosary or maybe rosary-like devotions previously where people might have a string of beads that they could pray and sort of count their prayers with. You may remember that what's sometimes called a proto-rosary, not really the completely developed rosary, but beads in which you could count prayers, hanging in the background of the Arnolfini double portrait by Jan van Eyck. But by this time, the rosary had been developed, and there was standard prayers, and the beads would stand for the different prayers that you were supposed to say. For the Ave, and the larger ones would stand for the Our Fathers, sort of punctuating many Aves. And so it's been suggested that this may have been created for a member of the Confraternity of the Rosary in Haarlem. And there is where you can see another angel holding up the rosary. Now, you undoubtedly notice that her body seems to be cut short, and you might say that you don't see her feet exactly, but the verse talks about the crescent moon at the feet of the woman clothed in the sun, and that she crushes under her feet the adder, or the symbol of the devil, a symbol of evil, that Mary conquers him, and sometimes shown as a dragon, sometimes shown as a serpent. Here it looks like a little dragon. It's supposed to represent the devil, in which Mary, by bearing the Christ child, has conquered the devil. She's crowned as Queen of Heaven, and she's surrounded by angels holding up these little signs. It's abbreviated, Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. In other words, holy, holy, holy. And Christ is ringing the bells. He's making music too. Bells sometimes were rung at the consecration of the host. And of course, the doxology, holy, 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 would be sung at the Mass. So this has a Eucharistic connection as well. And I thought you might want to see some of the details of some of the angels. You can see at the bottom an angel holding the crown of thorns. and another one holding the nails and a little hammer with which the nails were hammered in. And then further out, a little bit darker ring, the angels are making music with the sort of ancestor of the trombone. It's very interesting, I think, to music historians to see the different musical instruments that are shown in Netherlandish paintings, because they're often very, very accurate. I can see early versions of different kinds of musical instruments. And here you see one who is ringing bells, or on the far left, that look just like the ones the Christ child is ringing, and an angel holding the cross. And there, of course, we say some of the details of the angels further out making music. And here we also have some different types of instruments. And a different type of bell, like what we might be familiar with bells, and different instruments. This is a painting of a subject that you find very frequently in Northern art. You find many of these in Germany, but you also find some in the Netherlands, as well as this one, for example. German, it's Heilige Sippe. In English, we would call this holy kinship or holy kindred. And the late 15th, early 16th century is the height of these images. There's just many of them. They are referring to the extended family of Christ and a kind of legend that tells us about Christ and his family and his relatives. And of course, this is the female side of the relatives. The story of, it starts with the legend of St. Anne. And the story develops that she had 3 husbands. St. Anne is the mother of the Virgin Mary, and her name comes from the Proto-Evangelium, that non-canonical Gospel of St. James that we've talked about before. But the legend develops in a little more complex fashion. At any rate, the legend is that she was married 3 times. She was married to a guy named Cleophas, Salome, which is a little odd. Salome is a female name, but this is how the legend goes. And then finally to Joachim, the father of the Virgin Mary. And I'm showing you this picture from 2 different sources, because sometimes after they've cleaned something or with different lighting conditions, the colors look a bit different. Okay. By each husband, Mary has 1 daughter. And every one of them is named Mary. And she's very unoriginal in her names, I guess. Mary, who is the daughter of Joachim, is Jesus' mother, the Virgin Mary. And then the other ones are given the names of their father, Mary Cleophas, Mary Salome. Now, where do these come from? Well, some of them are how the Bible was interpreted. The Bible talks about brothers of Christ. And, this bothers some Christians, many Christians it bothers, particularly in the Middle Ages because, they believed that Mary was perpetually virgin. So, how could they have, she have any more children to be brothers or full brothers? Some people, I think, suggest that they might be Joseph's children by an earlier marriage or something like that. But St. Jerome, so we've got the authority of a saint here, he is writing about the perpetual virginity of Mary. He denounces anybody as a heretic who doubts the virginity of Mary. And he says that the brothers of Christ really mean that they are the cousins of Christ. Well, then they've got to have some aunts and uncles, I guess. Also, those names come from the Marys, or the holy women, who are at the tomb of Christ. Okay, so here's a little chart showing you how everybody what their progeny were. Okay, so each one of these people gets married. Mary, the daughter of Joachim, marries Joseph, and her child is Jesus, who is believed to be a divine child, not the progeny of Joseph, but he serves as a worthy foster parent. Mary Cleophas marries someone named Alphaeus, and they have children, James the Less, one of the disciples, Joseph the Just, Simon, and Jude. And Mary Salome marries a man named Zebedee, and you'll remember in the Bible, St. John and St. James, James Major as they call him, or James the Great, or the Greater, because there's two apostles named James, one called the Greater and one called the Lesser, that they are called the sons of Zebedee. So that's where Zebedee comes from. So Mary Salome marries Zebedee and gives birth to James and John, who are called the brothers of Christ in the Bible. Now, sometimes you'll have a sculpture or a painting that just shows Anne, the mother of Mary, the Virgin Mary, and the baby Jesus. And we've got a name for that too. Once again, it's in German. I mean, you think, in English we'd say St. Anne, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus. That's kind of long. In German, they shorten it a bit. They call it Anna selbst dritt, Anne herself three. So sort of Anne herself three times. And that is showing the, I guess you should say, the female genealogy of Christ, his mother and his grandmother. And there we see just the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. There, you have to sort of decipher who everybody is. Joachim, Anne's first husband and Mary's father, and Joseph, the father of Mary. And you can see this little boy who's holding a fuller's club. It looks like sort of a curving staff. And the legend of St. James the Less, or James Minor, was that this is the instrument of his death. And he's the son of Alphaeus and Mary Cleophas. I don't really expect you to remember all of these people, but you should know what a holy kinship is. Now, sometimes they extend it even further and include St. Elizabeth and John the Baptist, and sometimes her husband, Zacharias. You'll remember that John the Baptist in the Bible is the cousin of Jesus. St. Elizabeth is Mary's cousin, and so her children would be also, they'd be what we call them second cousins. And here you're seeing St. Elizabeth dressed in beautiful garments here, very fashionable, I'm sure. And the child has his hand reaching out, like he's reaching over to the baby Jesus and indicating him. And you'll remember that it was, John the Baptist who points to Christ and says, Ecce, Agnus Dei, behold, the Lamb of God. And just a tiny one, Mary Cleophas. Mary Salome, with her children, you see some of her children there, she's watching them. You see John the Evangelist, who is holding a chalice. Now, the story of John the Evangelist is when he grows up, he is given a chalice with poisoned wine. He makes the sign of the cross over it, and the poison departs in the form of a snake. And so very frequently you will see John the Baptist very frequently you will see John the Evangelist, in other words, the writer of the Gospel of St. John, holding a chalice. It's his symbol. And frequently you'll see the snake departing from the chalice. James is pouring wine, so they're having a little children enacting what will become the Eucharistic sacrament. And I'm just trying to see this a little bit. It looks to me like that might be a pilgrim's canteen or something. James is often associated with pilgrimage, so maybe he's pouring water, but presumably into the chalice would be wine. And Simon here holds a saw. It doesn't seem like a very good thing for a child to be holding, does it? But remember, what they're showing are objects that, at first glance seem to be toys or, objects the kids have picked up, but essentially are showing something about them. And the saw was the instrument of his martyrdom. And in this, you can see in a little bit, there's an altar in the background. It's shown as a kind of Jewish altar. And the figure there is Judas Thaddeus lighting the candles. And in the background, around this altar, we see Zacharias, we see other husbands. Zacharias, you remember, the father of John the Baptist, and the other husbands of Mary, the Marys and of Anne. And, the altar is shown as what the Christians imagined a Jewish altar would be, which is essentially a kind of Christian type of altar in the furnishings, but with stories from the Old Testament, but the ones that the Christians saw as foreshadowing the coming of Christ and having meaning in the Christian context. So we see a kind of statue on the altar, which presumably Jews would not have had statues on their altar. There is a commandment against graven images, but the Christians are showing it in as they understand, a sacred altar. And so that shows the sacrifice of Isaac, which is the prefiguration of Christ's crucifixion, which is reenacted on the Christian altar as the bloodless sacrifice that makes merits, reenacts the crucifixion and makes merits for the souls of mankind. And when I say, I know sometimes people will be a little upset with me when I say Christian. Remember, we're talking about the 15th century. This is Catholic art. But the Protestant Reformation as any kind of lasting institution and the institution of new denominations is yet to come. Now, there are some people who could be seen as precursors of the Reformation, such as Hus in Germany, but that wouldn't have had any effect on these artists in the Netherlands. Okay, then you can sort of see this Jewish altarpiece, as it were, which has subjects that you would see in Christian art as well. The fall of man, and partaking of the forbidden fruit, and the expulsion from Eden. In other words, the angel is driving Adam and Eve out of the earthly paradise. And as we said, this scene serves as references to Christ's sacrificial redemption of mankind from sin. And the sacrifice of Isaac as a prefiguration of the crucifixion and its continuation in the Mass. Well, we said that the Haarlem artists were very well known for their landscape, and we have seen some landscapes in the background of Geertgen tot Sint paintings. And here is one that is has a lot of landscape. You have the figure of St. John the Baptist in the foreground, with a little lamb next to him, so we know he's John the Baptist. The lamb, of course, is a symbol of Christ, the Agnus Dei, but it is John who gives Christ that title, behold, the Lamb of God. So You can use the lamb, either the symbol of Christ or the symbol of Christ who identifies St. John the Baptist. So here he is out in the wilderness. He's meditating. When we say wilderness, I think, we think of something like a desert or a overgrown forest with, barely get the light through or something like that. But the wilderness could also just be conceived as a place away from human habitation, outside the cities. And so to our eyes, this is a beautiful, idyllic landscape, but it is the wilderness. And John is shown in a pose that suggests that he is deep in contemplation. We see this in both Italy and Northern Europe, the figure resting his head, resting his cheek on his hand, his elbow on his knee, and he is thinking deeply. So he is shown as a contemplative saint here. And there's the little lamb. And this beautiful landscape. If you look at details, you can see, for example, little swans, perhaps little birds in the lake, some deer in the shadow of the trees. And just a little city in the background, probably Jerusalem. Just far, far away from human habitation is where John is meditating.